We're back. Hi, everyone. We are here to discuss the book Bridges, Ministering to Those Who Question by David Ostler, former Mormon bishop, stake president, mission president, and a remarkable interviewee, in my opinion. This book is published by Greg Koford Books, and it's all about, it's written to and for Orthodox, Mormons and leadership about how to minister to Mormons who question, who are in faith crisis, who doubt, and even who leave the church. And I think it's a marvelous book. I highly, highly recommend it. As I said in last episode, it's the book I wish that I had written if I could have been my best self. So it's a great book, and we're going to dig into it now. I have read the whole thing. I don't think there's a page that isn't marked. And I'm going to begin. I don't know why I picked this as a place to begin, but I'm going to start on page 130. And you write in the book, the other day I talked with a man named Jim who stopped believing and attending church several decades ago. As we discussed the average church experience, he said, "It's Sydney or the bush," an Australian saying that means it's all or nothing. In other words, he was expressing common sentiment that there isn't a way for someone to participate in the church if they are not a complete believer. And then he goes on to write, when Jim stopped attending, he believed in Christ and wanted to live his life in a Christ-like way, but he did not believe that the church had a monopoly on truth. He found it difficult to participate because he didn't agree with the claim that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the only true living church. We spent about an hour talking about whether someone like him could find space at church, even though we do teach and believe that the church has a unique role within the plan of salvation. Is there a place in our wards for Jim and for others who don't fully believe in every doctrine? And part of the reason why this struck me so hard is when my brother Joel was working at church headquarters as the chief information officer for the church, and I was going through my faith crisis and trying to minister to those, while I was still to those who were disaffected, he set up 2 meetings with Elder Holland. And in my, and I just thought, for weeks and weeks and weeks, I knew that I was going to be meeting with Elder Holland. And I thought, what am I going to ask him? Like, what in the world could I ask him? I'm not going to ask him about Fanny Alger. He probably doesn't have a good answer, and that's probably just going to be embarrassing for my brother and for him. I'm not going to ask him, I'm not going to ask him about church history tidbits. What can I ask him? And the one question I did ask him at the end of the interview was, is there a place in the church for Mormons like me, John Dehlin? And his response, it was almost like he rose from the table and he kind of pounded and he said, yes, there is a place in the church for John Dehlin and for Joel Dehlin. We want 100,000 John and Joel Dehlins in this church. And that was my first meeting with Elder Holland. And that got me really excited to think that there was a place. Obviously, things didn't work out so well for me and for others who have tried to go down this road of helping the church figure out how to minister to those who are struggling. But I think this book, I think that quote from Jim really gets to the heart of the matter. But I think it's twofold. So I think Jim's statement covers it, but there's kind of 2 parts. Can the church become an organization that's loving and supportive and compassionate and safe for someone who no longer believes some or all of the church's truth claims? And can that environment be compelling to make someone who has kind of lost their traditional faith want to stay in? And I think to me, that's the heart of your book. How do you feel about that as an introduction? And then we'll get into who the book's for and kind of what you're saying in the book.
Yeah, I don't know if I have all the answers on this. If, the story you tell about Elder Holland saying, there is a place for you, I think there's a different, there's an answer that I would say, which is we have to make a place for people like you at church. There clearly there is. The church's whole at its core, it is to bring all unto Christ. There isn't someone who it doesn't want to bring unto Christ. The terms of that are difficult because there's always an expectation in there that people are going to change in a way, and if they don't do that, then they're not coming unto Christ. I'm not sure I'm saying this real well, but I think there's two concepts here. One is we have to figure out the unintentional things that we do that make it difficult for people like Jim to feel like they can come and worship with us. And the book talks a lot about that. There is another kind of challenge which speaks to the desire that we have implicit in a word like ministering, which means that we're trying to fix people and make them a particular way so that they are coming unto Christ. And the church has motives. It should have motives. It has beliefs. It has passion and doctrine that compels us to want to come unto Christ, compels many to want to come unto Christ. And so it's not benign in this. It's an active participant, does want people to change in a particular way because they have doctrines and beliefs that compel us to want to change that way. But sometimes we're so dogmatic in our belief around that we make no space for people to come on their own terms, in their own stage, their own place in that setting. I'm not saying this very well. I'm sure you know where I'm going.
Yeah.
And you probably can ask some clarification that kind of breaks this up into little pieces. But I know when I was a bishop, for example, I did want people to change. But I did that so poorly that at times the things I did made them Jim's saying, I can't stay, which meant that I had no influence and no ability to be able to talk about the doctrines of Christ that I think are powerful and liberating.
Right. So how can the church guard what's precious, including its identity, its doctrine, its policies, its vitality, its strength, and still follow Christ's mission of trying to bring all, being the most effective as possible at bringing all into Christ, including those who doubt some or all of the Church's truth claims or have legitimate concerns about the Church's practices and policies.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think that is the question. And the answer is we can do a lot better than what we're doing.
That's the thing we know.
Yeah, we do. And, there's simple things that we can do.
Yeah.
That mean that I don't judge, I don't blame people for their questions or their doubts.
Right.
I recognize that they are intelligent people with agency and life experience that is different than mine, that sees things in a way that causes them to have questions.
Would you say those questions are credible?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they're credible to them, and many of them are credible to me. I get why some of these issues are really difficult for people.
Yeah.
But even if I don't, even if I say, just off the record, that's a stupid thing. You just shouldn't believe that, and I never say that. It just sticks in my mind and I think it. I have to recognize that it's valid and important to them. Mm-hmm. And if it's valid and important to them, it's real. It's what they're experiencing. And I can't try and take that away from them. That would be wrong because, number one, it's ineffective. Number two, it doesn't honor who they really are. And number three, it doesn't respect that they truly feel that way. So, we have to legitimize the issue. And we can't sweep it away, ignore it, gaslight it, judge it, label it, blame it. All of those kinds of things are just not helpful in terms of ministering to people.
I love it. So tell us again, you mentioned this in the first episode, but tell us again who your audience is for this book. Who did you have in mind when you wrote it?
I wrote it for traditionally believing members of the church so that they could better understand people that have doubts and questions and have left.
And a subset of that would be leaders, leaders in the church.
Yeah, I mean, and I really wrote it at a ward and stake level. So when you say leaders in the church, I don't mean,
That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
And in the
You're not
church,
trying to steady the ark.
there's issues above my pay grade, but I'm a member of a ward and a stake.
Yeah.
Right. And I've been a leader and will be a leader and get called in and out of things. And I'm a parent. And so all of these issues are really important to me in the sociality that I experience in a ward and in a stake. And so that's really where I've tried to write it to. That's where my experience is.
So this is for ward and stake members that want to support their church members and or friends and family, right?
Yeah.
Who have left.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things we haven't talked about, but I did a survey of ward and stake leaders. So
we'll make some references to that, but please tell us about that now.
But so there's about, I think, 514 that responded to the survey, largely North American. And I asked them many of these same questions. And one of the questions I asked them I think is really important is, do you think addressing faith crisis is important in your ward or stake? And, high answers here. I think like high 60s said strongly agree with that statement. And another 30% agreed. So there were very few people that said it's unimportant to address. And then, is it important to address in your family? And even higher numbers are there. So of these 514 leaders, they all recognize that addressing faith crisis is really important. Then I asked them if faith crisis had affected members in their ward or their family, their children, close friends, and it's affected everyone. I mean, there's probably someone it hasn't affected.
Yeah.
But it's affected pretty much every family that's out there, and it's an issue that is so different from the time I grew up. Certainly, we had people that had faith crises when I was young, or when I was in my young adult life, but it's different today, and because of that, it increasingly is affecting families, and so it's just a universal issue in the church. So it's not something that is some academic thing that you don't really need to worry about. It's at the core of our families and in our wards.
Do you get a sense that it's presenting the church with almost an existential problem, that it's that serious?
Yeah, I don't know how to define existential.
Yeah. A significant, is it becoming a significant problem for the church?
I think it is. You have the
Marlon Jensen quote in there.
Yeah, so Marlon said what he said. You probably can paraphrase it better.
Just that the church is experiencing an apostasy at the levels never before seen back to Kirtland, Ohio. In other words, a full third or half of active members leaving, kind of thing.
And that was a 2011 quote.
Right.
Am I right on that?
Yeah.
And so, has that slowed down or increased since then?
Right.
It's probably increased.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I did in the book was I tried to compile all the resources to help us understand and quantify disaffiliation within the church. And these aren't just church issues. These are all church issues, right? They're affecting Baptists and people of any faith community.
And you mentioned the rise of the nuns and the Pew Foundation study that just shows general disaffection religiously in the United States across the board.
Yeah. So, one of these is by a guy named Darren Sherkat, who's, I think, a sociologist in Southern Illinois University. And his data shows that, we probably are losing 50% of our millennials.
The LDS church. Right. Yeah.
So, and Gen Zers. So, people born after that, 1980 kind of time period.
Yeah, I tell mixed faith couples all the time, if you are expecting all your kids to stay faithful, you're going to be disappointed. And I tell the non-believing, if you're expecting all your kids to leave the church, you're probably going to be disappointed. Statistics show it's about 50-50 chance kids right now who are reaching adulthood are going to be staying in the church, right?
Yeah. So there's something fundamental about society today that makes affiliation with religion different than in times past. And some of those hit the church harder than others of those issues. I think there's many things that we can do to respond to those kinds of things. I don't think we have to be passive in having those societal trends wash over us. It's not inevitable that we will continue to have large rates of disaffiliation.
Right.
But I think the more we confront it, the more we know about it, the more we can respond in ways in our wards and in our families.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to clarify, the church is as long as I've been paying attention, 2/3 of all people in the world baptized Mormon have left the church. So like a 1/3 activity rate has been going on since 2005, as far as I'm aware. What's different is 50% of Mormons raised Mormon in the U.S. are leaving. And that's a much more stark thing when half of all children raised Mormon in the United States, once they reach adulthood, are leaving. That's a whole order of magnitude level more of severity than kind of what we've seen 2 or 3, 4 decades ago.
Yeah, and that's Shurkat's methodology. The methodology is what religion were you at age 16? What religion are you today? So he's measuring the ins and the outs and the flows between religion.
But that's on statistically, representative samples, and so it's,
right, and that's where he gets the 50%.
Yeah, right. And I think the Pew says something very similar about Mormons.
Yeah.
So, so as far as so you told us who the audience is. Okay, going back to your surveys, you talked about how many church leaders that you surveyed had family or friends or ward members who had left. Then you also asked them about to what extent is the church providing effective and meaningful resources to support people in a faith crisis? Talk just quickly about what you found when you asked leaders about that. So
leaders are committed to the church. And so I have to interpret their responses in that lens. And about 50% of them said that they are getting materials from the church to help them with this. It's actually a pretty low number. And it's not 50% strongly agree. It's 50% either strongly or agree with that statement. Then I asked them whether they are getting training in their ward about how to address it. And these numbers are really low. They are, maybe I should find them in the book and read them, should I?
Sure. And while you're doing that, I'll just buy you time. There's the issue of whether they're getting training and resources. Go ahead. Did you find it?
Yeah. So the statement is, I found the wrong one.
There's also the question of whether they knew about the gospel topic essays and whether they had read them. Those are also ones that were really illuminating to me.
So here's the statement that I asked leaders to express their agreement to. The church as a whole provides adequate information for leaders to help people who are in a faith crisis. And 9% of leaders strongly agreed with that, and 43% agreed. So that's kind of a lukewarm answer, in my opinion. Then our stake and ward provides training to leaders about faith crisis. These are leaders responding. 2% strongly agree, 13% agree. So 85% disagree.
That what?
That the stake and ward is providing training to them to address faith crisis.
Yep.
And then my ward leaders know how to effectively minister to individuals in a faith crisis. 1% strongly agree and 25% agree. And these are leaders. So, and then I asked
74% don't feel like
their leaders can effectively address it. Then I ask people in a faith crisis about this. And you know what the answers are here. My ward leaders know how to effectively minister to individuals in a faith crisis. 0.3% strongly agreed. Mm-hmm. 3.8% agreed. So what's that, 96%?
96%
disagreed?
Yeah.
the church as a whole provides adequate information for leaders to help people who are in a faith crisis. 0% strongly agreed, and 0.6% agreed. So they all know it's important, but we don't really know what to do about it. That's what that says to me. And faith crisis members say, yeah, they really don't know what to do about it. And so we make it up.
Yeah.
And we make it up the best way we know how to do. And it's usually without deep levels of understanding.
Yeah. I love that you quote like Thich Nhat Hanh and Brene Brown and Rabbi Herschel and...
don't forget Henry Nouwen.
Who's
He's
that?
a Catholic priest. He's Belgium.
Right.
I want to read that quote.
Even George Orwell in 1984. Like, I love that you draw from people that I really admire and respect in your book.
Oh, but I got to read this Nouwen quote.
Okay.
I put it at the head of chapter 1 because I think it's so important. And to me, it defines what I'm trying to accomplish with the book. Compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into the places of pain, to share in brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. Compassion requires us to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, and powerless with the powerless. Compassion means full immersion in the condition of being human. And that, to me, is the way in which we deal with it's either Sydney or the bush.
Right.
That's where Elder Holland was saying there is a place, and where I add we can make it a place, because by understanding and entering to those places of compassion and understanding, we then can just be more loving. And
I love it.
More responsive and more there.
Yeah, and that's one side of the coin, what we as members can do. On the other side of the coin is kind of like, as we've already talked about a bit, the dark night of the soul. And let me just read this Brene Brown quote you have on page 103. We believe that the most terrifying and destructive feeling that a person can experience is psychological isolation. Yeah. This is not the same as being alone. It is a feeling that one is locked out of the possibility of human connection and of being powerless to change the situation. In the extreme, psychological isolation can lead to a new sense of hopelessness and desperation. People will do almost anything to escape this combination of condemned isolation and powerlessness. And that's so significant because so many people, that describes so much of the dark night of the soul isn't really theological or historical. It's like, is my wife going to leave me? Are my parents going to disrespect me or disown me? Am I going to lose my community? Am I going to lose my friendships? And oftentimes people do lose all those things. But then even if they don't, there's sort of like being cut off from the word community, just in terms of like feeling isolated from believing family, believing friends, believing ward members. And that really, I think, gets to the heart of a good chunk of the dark night of the soul. It's not only dealing with your identity and your existential worldview and your theology and feeling betrayed by the organization, but it's staring at the real possibility of isolation from everyone you really care about, sometimes including your own children.
Yeah. You know, this would have been great to add another paragraph just right after it that kind of connects that also to perhaps a suicide ideation that comes, you know, in this experience.
Yeah.
When she talks about, you know, anything to escape this sense of isolation and loneliness. And I didn't mention that, but that would be there in any sort of revision. And I go back to Mike's experience where Mike had this dark night of soul for a year, and he couldn't talk to his wife about it. You know, so this aloneness, who am I? What can I believe? What can I trust? What are the implications of what I feel? weigh on him for that extended period of time.
Yeah. All right. So as you begin the book, you list, or at least I wrote down, three main issues that you pulled together from, and I don't have a page number for this, but that you pulled together from your survey about kind of a way that you would summarize some of the main problems that that people who have become disaffected had. You mentioned the one true church narrative, that it's the one and only true church on the face of the earth, and that it's either all true or all false. You mentioned that the church has not been open and honest about its troubling history, so they feel lied to or betrayed or whatever. And that the church has modeled how not to treat people who lose their, that the church has poorly modeled how to treat people who lose their faith, silencing, and this may be my notes, but silencing, excommunication, marginalization, shunning, false impressions, and stereotype.
Yeah, I don't think I quite say it the way you do.
Yeah, go ahead.
So
I'm just reading from my notes, so I don't know how much of that's...
So, I kind of go through all of the issues, church history, LGBTQ issues, gender roles. This is kind of starts on page 28. So there's a section here on church history and the implications of that, and the church's LGBTQ policies and practices, unequal gender roles, feelings of judgment and anxiety at church, concerns about prophetic leadership and revelation, cultural language issues, political conservatism, mental and emotional challenges, and then some unique issues for millennials. I kind of think that these, I found it difficult to kind of categorize why people leave, and in kind of my uneducated way, but someone who has more experience here could refine this. I kind of felt like there were three underlying issues, and this may be where you're going. And the first was trust. And the way I write that is even with limitations of church members and leaders. So these are the positive aspects of that. If someone felt like they had these three attributes, then they likely would feel comfortable being a member of the church and being fully believing. So first is I have trust. Even with the limitations of church members and leaders, I have confidence that the church and its leaders will help me find spiritual purpose and guidance. I trust church leaders and other members to help me as I make choices for my own spiritual growth. And that breaks with many, many people. And whether it's church history because I feel I've been lied to, or because there's a policy that I disagree with strongly, I don't feel like I can trust church leaders. The second issue is belonging. My ward accepts my authentic self and supports me as I develop my own spirituality and relationship to God. I feel like I belong and feel love, acceptance, and support, even with my differences. And there's many people that don't feel like they can stay because they don't feel like they belong. This was kind of part of the substance of the conversation you had with Elder Holland. And then meaning and relevance. I feel spiritually lifted when I think of church doctrines and participate. I feel my most important questions are addressed and answered. I feel closer to my heavenly parents and find meaning and direction in the teachings and the doctrine of the church. So I think all these kind of they're not little, all these issues that we could list, and we could list all the CES letter issues and a whole lot of others, get to issues of trust, belonging, and meaning. And I think if we think about them in that way, we're better able to address specific issues and better able to create an environment where people feel like they can stay even if they don't believe everything.
Yeah, and that's in chapter 3. I apologize. Those three summary points that I culled together came somehow from the introduction, and I did some of this at like 3:30 in the morning today. So
no problem.
I apologize. I wasn't trying to impute upon you things you didn't say, but somehow I pulled that out from that early chapter. So
well, I think I touch on all those issues.
Okay.
I do touch on those issues. I don't, but they're not kind of the major.
Sorry, that I wasn't meaning, because I was going to get to chapter 3. So I'm glad you got to it. Going back quickly just to chapter 1, which is called A Different Time. We've already talked about the level of disaffection. We've already kind of covered it, but you basically come up with the statistic that 360,000 left between 2007 and 2014, which you quote as 25 members in each congregation. And that's just between 2007 and 2014. That's not from 2014 to now, right?
Right.
Which is about 51,500 a year that I did a quick divided 360,000 by 7, and that's what I got. It's probably plus or minus something like that. And then you talk about how millennials, it's a lot worse than Gen X, which is worse than the boomer side of the generation. That reflects the Pew Foundation's study that the younger the kids get, the more likely they are to experience the faith crisis. And then you talk about the declining church growth, that there's been a 12% increase in membership, but only a 7.7% increase in units, which shows that the church, what does that show?
It just shows that we're not growing as fast as we used to. So if population is growing faster than units, either the units are getting larger or there's less people in the pews. Yeah.
And I think we all know it's the latter. So.
Yeah. And there's an update on that. We do know what 2018 was. And 2018, I think church-wide created less than 60 units. You might know, I think it was like 55 new wards and branches, in the church.
Was that net new?
That's net new.
Minus the ones they got rid of, because they did close a lot of branches.
Well, and I know they opened a lot of them in Sierra Leone and the Philippines. And
right.
So, if we're growing it at a net positive 50 units, either we're structurally changing what we define as a unit, or with all the growth that happens in some of those high growth areas, they have to be being offset by reductions in first world areas.
Yeah, it's almost like the church is in severe decline in Western Europe, many parts of the United States, and Canada, and developed Asia, let's just say. And that's a significant decline, but that is, like you said, being offset by the Philippines, Latin America sometimes, and Africa. Yeah. So in some way, that because maybe the heart and strength sometimes of the church is kind of along the Wasatch Front and its pioneer generation members, along with the tithing revenues and stuff, it is a serious thing to have the developed world in decline. Although I'm sure people would take exception, especially Gina Colvin, to say the heart of the strength of the church is the members along the Wasatch Front. So I don't mean to be insensitive to the people outside.
They're really just in New Hampshire.
But the point made, it's a challenge. In chapter 2, you go on to talk about millennials and how millennials are different than previous generations. And you talk about a low respect for authority, more internally driven, more into diversity and inclusivity versus exclusivity. Anything you want to say about millennials really quickly?
No, just I think for people my age, we think we're experienced and we've been all these church leaders, so we kind of think we know it. But we really don't know what's in the minds of millennials and Gen Zers because we don't experience what they've experienced. My psyche was formed in a particular time and culture, and that time and culture is over, and new psyches are being formed, and they have to grapple with a different world than what I experienced growing up. So the way in which they interact with spirituality and meaning and belief and direction and purpose, all
and
those
authority,
and authority and institutions and
yeah.
All of that world is just different today.
Yeah.
And I can understand that, but it's so academic and remote that I really don't know what goes on in their minds.
Yeah.
And if we think we do, and if we think we know what will resonate with them, we will likely be wrong.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the point of that chapter is, it's not the same. Don't think it's the same. If you think it's the same, you're going to blow it. You're not going to be able to develop, if I tell the stories to my kids about how I developed faith, in the 70s and in the 60s, there's parts that are going to be relevant, but much of it's not.
And that's part of a structural challenge with the church that I don't want to be disrespectful or flippant about, but the church is run at the top levels by octogenarians and nonagenarians. And there's a lot of value that comes from that level of experience and, seasoned wisdom and knowledge. And that's got to be hard for 80. I mean, you and I struggle to understand 20-year-olds today. Sometimes I think, how would an 80 or 90-year-old who was sort of raised in World War II and right after in the 50s, how hard would it be for them, right?
Yeah.
To wrap their brain around 20-year-olds.
And, if they did it full time, they'd get it done. But
right.
There's lots of things they got on their plate.
It's a multi-billion-dollar kind of organization, right?
Yeah, but the good thing is that much of the culture can be defined in our wards where we do have millennials, where they sit and can be
hopefully
brought in and counseled with us, and where we're raising them in our homes, and we can listen to them and learn in that local unit in a way that regardless of, what policy comes out.
I love that.
We can do things differently in our wards.
I love that. So let's worry about what we can do at our level. That's what I hear you saying. That's the whole purpose of the book.
That's what I can do.
That's awesome.
The only way I can contribute.
Yeah. You also talk about, it's a great chapter. You talk about the lower switching costs for millennials in terms of leaving their religion or switching.
They're still pretty high, aren't they, John? Don't you personally kind of feel the high switching costs?
They're still high.
Yeah.
But for some reason, millennials feel it less than 40. I see 40 or 50-year-olds or sometimes 70 or 80-year-olds trying to leave the church or change their relationship with the church. And it's a bit of a different equation. Yeah. It's kind of the older you get, the harder it is to leave.
Yeah. And
all of a sudden your grandkids, your children won't let you have access to your grandkids if you're a grandparent and you've raised them devout Mormon, but then you no longer believe. And so that's a whole different ballgame than if you're 20 and you're not even married yet, right?
But think of it 50 years ago when, switching costs were a lot higher and, living in a rural Utah town and having no choice but to stay there. And so you go to church, right? Because if you don't sell your crops and you can't move out of state. And so, it's a different world.
Yeah. Yeah. And just the fact that community now, all the different communities for progressive and post-Mormons, those emerged in the past 10, 20 years. They didn't exist before. But. All right. And of course, the availability, you talk about the availability of technology and of Google, and that's all really central to this whole problem. What happened in 2004, 2005, blogs and podcasts and Google and the internet and Facebook all started emerging. And that's clearly what made this a problem the church could no longer avoid. And you've got a great part, Gone Are the Days. I really recommend the way that people read, the way you end chapter 2. Gone are the days when we can control how history is told. Gone are the days when our members only have access to church-published materials. Gone are the days when it is uncommon to find church members who have questions about church history or policy. Gone are the days when it can be assumed that members share an unreserved trust in church leaders and the institutional church. It is a different day. I love that.
Well, I'm using President Ballard's remarks. He did an old talk to the CES instructors in February of 2016 that was Gone Are the Days. Mm-hmm. And, we just live in a different time. Let's just acknowledge that.
Ballard may be the most referenced apostle in the book.
Is he?
Is that
Could be.
What your memory is? Yeah.
Or Elder Uchtdorf.
Uchtdorf, yeah.
Both have talked a lot about this topic.
Yeah. So in chapter 3, Chapter 3 is entitled Why People Leave. And that's honestly, that's the first chapter I jumped to because I wanted to see if you got that right.
Did I get it close?
Oh, yeah. You were great. It's great. I think in 2005, 2006, I created a PowerPoint presentation called Why People Leave the LDS Church and What We Can Do About It. And then later, after I did the Marlon Jensen study with Travis Stratford and Hans Matson, and we shared that with church headquarters, I updated it with the information from our study that I think you did say Greg Prince had shared with you.
Greg Prince shared the study, and I think that was in there.
And the book that was compiled. But I've been thinking, about that forever. And we studied 3,000 plus people who had left the church about why they had left. And it was an early study, but I think you hit all the important parts. You've already summarized them. You talk about testimony, and then you talk about trust, belonging, and meaning and relevance. But it's those three, trust, belonging, and meaning and relevance, that the book is structured around, right? And that's what we found, that most people, it wasn't the church history in and of itself as much as it was feeling betrayed and lied to and deceived by the church. And then do they feel a sense of belonging, and does the church provide meaning? Those are two things that we didn't explore that I think were great additions. And as you mentioned previously, and I apologize that I confused you with that early quote, you went on to list the reasons people leave in order of relevance. History, right? LGBTQ issues, unequal gender roles, feelings of judgment and anxiety, concerns about prophetic leadership and revelation, culture and language issues, political conservatism, mental and emotional challenges, and then you end with millennial issues. So is that did I get that right?
Yeah, you did.
Anything you want to say about any or all of those points? I think our listeners have all know those issues.
I struggled with this chapter. This is a chapter that probably took me longer than anything to write, because for many people that I'm writing to, this might be the first time they've encountered a long list like this.
For sure.
They haven't read the CES letter, and so this might be the longest list of concerns they've read.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to be honest about the issue, but I didn't want to trigger a faith crisis or have them close the book because it felt too negative.
Right.
So I think that is one of the central challenges in addressing this. You have to face it, but if you face it, you can be destructive. So how do we as a church kind of come to grips with these issues and acknowledge them as being real, and acknowledging the significance that they can be to some individual or many individuals, and not and still provide a pathway of faith and growth for people. So I don't know if I got the balance right. I tried. I hope that you felt, and other readers who are very aware of these issues felt, that I was honest and authentic and direct about them. But I also hope that a bishop who's never experienced this, that really wants to understand this, doesn't read this and say, oh, now I got a problem, or, I can't read this book because, it disturbs me.
Yeah, I feel like the entire book is strong. I don't want to say bold. I don't want to mischaracterize it in a way that you don't like. But I did not feel like I felt like you were diplomatic, but still direct and sometimes strong. Even though I don't think your language was sharp, it's just the issues are hard. And if you're going to be honest about the issues, then it does come across sometimes as strong. But I thought you did as good of a job as I could possibly imagine in being soft and diplomatic while still being strong.
Well, there were a lot of rewrites.
I'm sure. What I didn't mention, and this isn't a criticism, but there is kind of one big category that doesn't get encapsulated in history, that actually doesn't quite appear on this list. It's kind of the Book of Mormon historicity, the Book of Abraham historicity, and just the question around translation and are those books, is our scripture authentic? And
add the Bible and the Old Testament,
right.
So what is Scripture, I think, is an issue for people. It certainly could be
Did it not
there.
come up in the survey, or did you just intend to lump that under history? Or
No, it's not history.
Or is that
You're
one of the
right.
issues? Because the church has never done a gospel topic essay on Book of Mormon historicity.
Yeah.
And I think, and it's not because it's not an issue.
You don't think Elder Callister's book was that essay?
I haven't read Callister's book yet. I should, but I mean, I just mean a gospel topics essay.
Yeah.
And I just have to think. I mean, Grant Palmer's entire book, and a lot of the CES letter really is on the historicity of the Book of Mormon and Book of Abraham. And I'm not. It's not a criticism. Tell me if that was.
So Givens, has a new book, and I haven't read his book on Book of Abraham. So that may be an attempt there, but yeah, it's an issue. I don't think it slapped me in the face.
Okay.
Through the questions, but I'm certainly aware that is an issue for people.
Right.
I'm aware of
DNA and all that stuff.
Yeah,
I guess the church did do a DNA essay.
They did a DNA, but that's not what you're talking about here.
It's anachronisms and all that stuff. And Isaiah.
I remember listening to a symposium up at Utah State.
I was there.
Were you?
On translation.
Were you a participant?
No, they did not invite me to participate in that.
But I listened to that, so I kind of understand the different ways, and I think Givens was there, and Bushman, and Reese, was she
Jana
there?
Reese, yeah. Phil Barlow.
There was another
Rosalind
woman.
Welsh.
Rosalind Welsh was the other. And so, I'm kind of aware of those issues. I'm aware of the issues about a historic Jesus. And so you get into, kind of what is Scripture? Where did it come from? How do I read it? What are the claims that we make about it? How durable are those claims? So, it probably could be added here.
But you have read about like the steel and the horses and the DNA and the Isaiah stuff.
Sure.
The anachronistic stuff that's in the book. Okay. It's not a big deal. I didn't even plan to talk about that, but it just jumped out at me as I was reading
it's not in there. It wasn't some intentional act on my part to not put it in
you're
there.
saying it didn't jump out at you in the data you read. Yeah. Makes total sense. I love at the end of this chapter the section on some assumptions to reconsider. This is one of the huge issues for people who leave the church when members assume that it's because they didn't read the scriptures enough, they didn't pray enough, they didn't go to the temple enough, they wanted to drink beer, they wanted to sin, they were offended in some way. And you just hit that out of the park. Do you want to read kind of the statistical points there at the bottom of 43?
Yeah. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take away the straw men that people use, the quick assumptions that allow us to explain away this problem.
Dismiss, right?
Yeah, or to blame people.
Right.
So I redid my Faith Crisis member survey because I wanted to have some of this data. So I did it twice, and the results came out very similar for the questions. But these questions did not appear in the first version.
Nice.
So
that's a lot of work to redo a survey.
Yeah, and am I going to get the same results? And I did, and that was encouraging. In the Faith Crisis member survey, I asked about individuals' religious practices at the time of their faith crisis. 86% believed wholeheartedly in the teachings of the church. 98% held a temple recommend. I'll just pause on that one. That to me says that my survey is truly not representative, right? I mean, this is a very unique group of people that apparently I got. Because most of them were holding temple recommends.
Right.
Almost all of them were.
Right.
But knowing that actually is really useful, because what that means is that people who are completely inside the church can have a faith crisis. 98% were keeping all the commandments. 64% were reading their scriptures daily, which seems low, but that's actually above average according to when you compare it to Reese data. That's why there's a footnote there. 82% were having meaningful personal prayer. 99% attended church weekly. 79% of those who were endowed attended the temple regularly.
Yeah. So these are, as Marlon Jensen was quoted as saying, these are the best and some of the best and the brightest the church has. It's former, an area, at least one area authority. I know of one general authority who've stopped believing in the church. He's a member of the presidency of the 70. Many patriarchs, former patriarchs, temple, or stake presidents, bishops, etc. Right? It's really study presidents, APs on missions. It's people who are highly committed.
Yeah, and there's lots of people who leave, but there is that group of people that are highly committed that do leave. So, I think the narrative, we need to have a more accurate narrative on this. I think that's helpful for the church. I don't think that is harmful for the church to acknowledge this as an issue. I think if we cannot face this, we cannot solve it. Then we're in that Berlin subway.
Right.
Denying.
James Baldwin, is that right?
Yeah, James Baldwin.
Tell us the quote again.
That which we cannot confront, we cannot change.
Right.
And, he's a black gay civil rights leader of the 60s. So, he personally felt that, I'm sure.
Yeah. Chapter 4 is entitled Confronting Today's Challenges of Faith. Tell us what the purpose of this chapter is.
I felt like I needed to have a chapter that kind of balanced out chapter 3. Chapter 3.
We kind of got heavy and negative
yeah,
a bit
it's kind of like,
3.
woe is me, here's all these problems. And so, what I kind of tried to do with chapter 4 was to talk about faith, maybe in a different way that allowed us to consider ways to deal with weaknesses of leaders, of confronting our history, of facing things honestly, of returning focus back to Jesus Christ, of kind of understanding that we make mistakes. And so I'm trying to, in some ways, subtly address other issues that people come up with, but provide kind of a faithful way to consider them and pattern how someone like myself has found testimony even after being fully aware of chapter 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if it's okay, I highlighted a few things to ask you about. So the first point you're making seemed a little bit out of place for me, but I've heard other people say it. I've heard this sort of semi-apologetic quote that like people leave the church not for studying church history too much, but for studying it too little. And what's implied is that if you study church history a little bit, then it'll cause you to leave the church. But if you study it really in depth and deep, it'll actually be strengthening to your faith. And so I'm not sure if you're trying to say that, but I have heard that said. Tell me how you respond and what you were trying to say, that studying church history can actually help your faith grow.
Well, I don't know if I would say it like that, but I would say that,
and I wasn't trying to quote you, but I've heard others say that.
Yeah, and I've heard others say that too, and that doesn't completely resonate with me. We are who we are. We, as members of the church, massacred children at Mountain Meadows, right? That's who we are. We had a prophet who practiced polygamy, polyandry, withheld it from Emma.
I wasn't honest about it, yeah.
So, that's who we are. We had, for a long time, a ban on temple ordinances and priesthood ordination to people just because of their race, whatever race means, but because of their skin color. And, that's who we are, right? And we can kind of pretend that those things didn't happen. But pretty much everyone who grows up in the church is going to find out about those things. And if we don't incorporate that into who we are, then they will feel a broken trust, and they will feel deceived. So I think I quote Patrick Mason here, where Patrick says it's not enough to know church history. We have to kind of do the work to understand the implications on our faith. And I think he says that fully knowing that some will leave because of the implications on faith. So I'm not to the point, I don't believe personally that once we understand everything, it will reconfirm all of the goodness of the early acts of the restoration. But I believe that it is a part of who we are, and that as we confront that, there actually are some interesting gospel truths that come out of that. One is, God works through really imperfect people. And that's okay with him. And
reading the scriptures lowers your standard for a prophet if you read them deeply, whether it's David or Job or any of them, Abraham, Isaac, and Peter, right?
Oh, and what that means for me personally is I fit in, right?
Right.
My impossible quest to become perfect, which, by the way, I gave up a long time ago, is fruitless. But that I have to rely upon the grace and the goodness of God in the imperfections in me and in the imperfections around me. There was never a time where there weren't those imperfections. There never should be a standard that is set up that raises a level of perfection in who we are and in our leaders. And so I think actually by studying church history, we probably do gain insights into how God works with imperfect people trapped in imperfect culture and tries to elevate us and tries to make us better.
Right.
So I don't know if that's a completely responsive answer to what you say there. It's who we are, and I think there actually are some interesting lessons in there.
Sure. And I think you acknowledge that when members, and you talk about this later in the book as well, when they overly estimate the, church leaders, for example, and have too much expectation of church leaders or even of the church itself, they kind of come by that honestly because they're kind of taught to be reverential and deferential and to kind of view everything as kind of a true false in kind of a true false paradigm, right?
Yeah.
Or inspired or not inspired. Or
yeah. So I think we can set people up for that kind of crisis by the way we talk about it. And the church does talk that way. I want to acknowledge that. I don't want to gaslight and say that because I can find a couple of quotes from leaders where they say, hey,
give Brother Joseph a break.
Yeah, he's imperfect. Or, Elder Uchtdorf says, we're all kind of works in progress. Elder Holland says, this is all the Lord has to work with. Be kind to your leaders. We're human too. And, I think President Ballard says something like, just because we're general authorities doesn't mean we're authorities in all things. We're trying to figure it out too. Go find an authority if you want an authoritative. Right. So, there are those quotes, but there certainly is a culture.
Yeah, you stand when they enter the room.
And we use titles.
President Nelson's birthday celebration. There's a lot of leader worship.
Yeah.
And a lot of an emphasis on exact obedience and follow the prophet, don't go astray. And that's part of the tension we live in.
Yeah, and, I was a ward and a stake and a mission leader, and, it feels good.
It is good to be the king.
I think I remember that reference. But, if I had my own way, we'd all just be brothers and sisters and have titles, but that's not part of my plan.